had always wanted to go on a cruise. The idea of being out at sea, surrounded by nothing but the vast ocean, seemed peaceful. So when my friends invited me on a week-long cruise, I jumped at the chance. The ship was huge, with pools, restaurants, and even a movie theater. It felt like a floating city, and I was excited for the adventure ahead. The first couple of days were perfect. We spent our time sunbathing on the deck, eating delicious food, and exploring the ship. At night, we'd watch the stars from the balcony of our cabin, enjoying the cool breeze and the sound of the waves. But on the third night, things started to get strange. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling cold. The air in our cabin felt icy, even though the weather had been warm all day. I glanced at the small clock on the nightstand, 3:15 a.m. The room was pitch black, except for a faint light coming from under the door. At first, I thought it was just the hallway lights, but the light wasn't steady. It flickered, like a candle, casting strange shadows that danced on the floor. I lay there, listening, and that's when I heard it, a soft knock on the door. My heart started to race. Who would be knocking at this hour? My friends were all asleep in the next cabin, and no one else should have been visiting in the middle of the night. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a faint whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound sent chills down my spine. I didn't dare answer the door. I pulled the blankets up to my chin and stayed completely still, hoping whoever it was would go away. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I asked my friends if they had heard anything strange during the night, but they all shook their heads. "You probably just had a bad dream," one of them said, but I knew it wasn't a dream. That day, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. Every time I walked down the narrow hallways of the ship, I felt like someone was watching me. I would turn around, but there was never anyone there. That night, the knocking came again. It was louder this time, more urgent. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I didn't want to open the door, but I needed to know who or what was out there. I slowly got out of bed and tiptoed toward the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no answer, just the sound of soft breathing on the other side of the door. I froze, listening, my heart hammering in my chest. Then in a low voice, I heard someone whisper, "Let me in." The voice was raspy, almost like a growl, and it didn't sound human. I backed away from the door, terrified. The whispering continued, "Let me in." I stumbled back to my bed, too scared to open the door, too scared to even breathe. The knocking stopped after what felt like hours, but I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I went to the ship's reception to report what had happened, but the staff didn't seem concerned. "It's probably just another guest playing a prank," they said. But I wasn't convinced. Something about the voice had felt wrong. Later that evening, I was talking to one of the older passengers on the deck when I mentioned the strange knocking. Her face went pale, and she looked around nervously before whispering, "You've heard it too?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" She leaned in closer and whispered, "This ship, it's haunted. Years ago, a young woman went missing on board during a storm. They searched the entire ship, but they never found her. Some say she fell overboard, but others think something else happened. Ever since then, people have heard knocking late at night, like she's trying to come back. They say her spirit is still looking for someone to open the door." My blood turned cold. I wanted to believe she was just telling a ghost story, but deep down, I knew there was something more to it. That night, I didn't want to go back to my cabin. But I couldn't stay up all night, so I reluctantly went to bed, hoping the knocking wouldn't come again. But it did. This time, the knocking was frantic, like something was desperately trying to get in. The door rattled, and the whispers grew louder. "Let me in," the voice said, almost pleading. "Let me in." I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voice seemed to be inside my head, echoing over and over. Then suddenly, everything stopped. The room was silent, but the air felt colder than ever. I didn't move, didn't breathe, afraid that if I did, the knocking would start again. In the morning, I packed my bags and told my friends I wasn't staying on the ship any longer. I made up some excuse about feeling seasick, but the truth was, I couldn't stand being there for another night. As soon as we docked at the next port, I left the ship and never looked back. Even now, I still have nightmares about that cruise. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, sure that I can hear soft knocking at my door and a whisper on the other side, begging to be let in. I'd never been on a cruise before, so when my family suggested we take one for vacation, I was really excited. The ship was huge, with bright lights, pools, restaurants, and endless entertainment. It felt like we were staying in a floating hotel. Everyone seemed happy and excited for the trip. At first, I was too. The first 2 days were great. We spent our time swimming, eating at the buffet, and exploring the ship. The weather was perfect, and the ocean stretched out as far as the eye could see. It was peaceful, even relaxing. But on the third night, things started to get strange. It was around midnight when I woke up to the sound of tapping on the wall beside my bed. At first, I thought it was just the ship creaking, but the tapping was too steady, too controlled. I sat up in bed, confused and half asleep, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from. It almost sounded like someone was knocking. I got out of bed and walked to the door of our cabin, thinking maybe it was my brother playing a joke on me. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. No one was there. I shrugged it off and went back to bed, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the next night, the tapping came back. This time, it was louder, like someone knocking right on the door. I hesitated before getting up to check. When I opened the door again, the hallway was still empty. But this time, something felt wrong. The air was cold, even though the ship had been warm all day. I closed the door and locked it, feeling uneasy. The next morning, I asked my family if anyone had heard the knocking. They all shook their heads, saying they hadn't heard anything strange. My mom laughed it off, telling me it was probably just the wind or the ship moving. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. That night, I went to bed early, hoping to get a good night's sleep. But around a.m., I woke up again. This time, it wasn't just tapping. It was loud knocking, and it was coming from the bathroom inside our cabin. I sat up, my heart racing. No one else in the cabin was awake. I slowly got out of bed, my hands shaking as I walked toward the bathroom door. The knocking continued, steady and loud. I reached for the doorknob, but then I stopped. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I suddenly didn't want to open the door. Something inside me told me not to. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I climbed back into bed and pulled the covers over my head, trying to block out the sound. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped, and the room fell silent. The next morning, I told my family what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They said I must have been dreaming, but I knew what I had heard. Something was in that cabin. Later that day, I decided to explore the ship on my own. I wanted to clear my head, to stop thinking about the strange noises. As I walked through one of the lower decks, I overheard 2 crew members talking. One of them mentioned something about the old story of a woman who had disappeared on the ship years ago. They said she had been a passenger, but one night she vanished. No one ever found her. I felt a chill as I listened, remembering the cold knocking in my cabin. Could it be connected? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the knocking to start again. But this time, it was different. Around 3 a.m., I heard a soft whisper. It was so faint, I could barely make it out, but it was there. Someone was whispering just outside my cabin door. I froze, my whole body tense with fear. The whispering grew louder, like someone was standing right outside, just inches away from the door. I couldn't understand the words, but the voice sounded desperate, almost pleading. I wanted to wake my family, but I was too scared to move. I just lay there, listening to the whispers, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I told my family I wanted to leave the ship. We still had a few days left of the cruise, but I couldn't stay on board any longer. My mom tried to reassure me, saying it was just my imagination, but I knew it wasn't. Something was wrong with that ship. When we finally docked, and I stepped off the ship, I felt a huge wave of relief wash over me. The cold, uneasy feeling disappeared as soon as I was back on solid ground. I never went on another cruise again, and every now and then, when I'm alone in the dark, I think I can still hear that faint whisper, asking to be let in. I was thrilled when my friend Sarah invited me on a cruise. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip, 7 days on a beautiful ship, sailing across the ocean. We were both excited for the sun, the food, and the fun. The ship was massive, like a floating city. There were swimming pools, restaurants, and even a small theater. Everything looked shiny and new, and we spent the first 2 days enjoying the luxury. But on the third night, something strange happened. We had gone to bed early after a long day at the pool. Our cabin was on one of the lower decks, away from the busy areas, so it was quiet. I was half asleep when I heard it, a soft, steady knocking on our cabin door. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but the knocking continued, slow and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I rolled over and glanced at Sarah. She was fast asleep. I sat up, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just someone at the wrong door. But then the knock came again, this time louder. Reluctantly, I got out of bed and tiptoed to the door. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaky. No answer. I opened the door just a crack and peeked into the hallway. It was completely empty. No one was there, just the dim lights lining the long corridor. I shut the door quickly, locking it behind me. My skin prickled with unease. Trying to calm myself, I crawled back into bed, telling myself it was probably just a crew member checking the cabins. But the next night, it happened again. This time, I was wide awake when the knocking started. It was louder than before, more urgent. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, staring at the door from my bed. Sarah stirred beside me but didn't wake up. The knocking grew faster, almost angry. I wanted to shout, to ask who it was, but fear held my voice back. Instead, I lay there, listening as the knocking eventually faded into silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning I asked Sarah if she'd heard anything, but she shook her head. "You're probably just hearing things," she said, laughing it off. But I wasn't so sure. That afternoon we overheard some passengers talking about the ship's history. One of them mentioned that a few years ago, someone had disappeared during a cruise, right in the middle of the night. They said the woman had been traveling alone, and no one ever found out what happened to her. Some believed she had fallen overboard, others thought something more mysterious had occurred. A chill ran down my spine when I heard the story. Could the knocking be connected to her? It seemed impossible, but the thought lingered in my mind. That night, I lay in bed, unable to relax. My eyes stayed fixed on the door, waiting for the sound I now dreaded. Sure enough, around 3 a.m., the knocking began again. But this time, something was different. The knock wasn't coming from the door, it was coming from inside the cabin. My heart raced as I sat up, looking around in the darkness. The sound was faint, but it was coming from the bathroom door. Tap, tap, tap. I wanted to wake Sarah, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The knocking continued, steady and cold, as if something or someone was behind that door, waiting to be let out. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" She groaned and turned over, still half asleep. "It's nothing," she mumbled. but I knew it wasn't nothing. I got up slowly, my legs shaking, and crept toward the bathroom door. My hand hovered over the handle. I didn't want to open it, but the knocking wouldn't stop. Just as I was about to touch the doorknob, the knocking ceased. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. My heart pounded in my ears as I stood frozen in front of the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. I backed away, my breath shallow, and crawled back into bed, my eyes never leaving the bathroom door. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I told Sarah everything. This time she didn't laugh. She could see how scared I was, and we agreed to talk to the ship's crew. When we explained what had been happening, the crew didn't seem surprised. One of the workers, an older man, pulled us aside and quietly told us about the ghost stories that had been passed around by staff for years. He said that some passengers reported hearing strange knocks at night or seeing shadows that didn't belong to anyone. "We try not to scare people," he said, his voice low, "but there are things on this ship, things we don't talk about." That was all I needed to hear. For the rest of the cruise, I refused to be alone in the cabin at night, and every knock or creak made me jump. I counted the days until we would be back on solid land. When we finally docked, I felt a wave of relief wash over me as we stepped off the ship. I didn't care about the money or the experience. I just wanted to leave that haunted place behind. Even now, whenever I think about that trip, I can still hear the soft tapping in the back of my mind. And I wonder, was it just my imagination, or was something really trying to get in? I had never been on a cruise before, so when my parents surprised me with tickets for a week-long vacation at sea, I was beyond excited. The ship was huge, almost like a floating city. It had everything: restaurants, swimming pools, theaters, and even a shopping mall. It felt like paradise. The first few days were great. We explored the ship, watched shows, and ate all the food we could. At night, the ocean stretched out like an endless black mirror, and I found it peaceful to listen to the waves as I fell asleep. But on the fourth night, something strange happened. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a soft knock on our cabin door. It wasn't loud, just a gentle tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was part of my dream, but the knocking continued. I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes, and listened carefully. There it was again, tap, 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 as if someone was standing just outside, waiting. I looked over at my parents, who were still asleep, and decided to check the door. Maybe someone was lost and needed help. I got out of bed, my bare feet cold on the floor, and walked to the door. Slowly, I opened it just a crack, peeking out into the hallway. It was empty. The long corridor was silent, lit only by a few dim lights, and there was no one in sight. Confused, I closed the door and locked it before climbing back into bed. I told myself it was probably just a mistake, maybe a kid playing around or someone knocking on the wrong door. The next day, I almost forgot about it, but something felt off. When we were walking around the ship, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see someone following us, but there was never anyone there. That night, the knocking returned. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. I glanced at the clock, a.m. I wasn't dreaming, and I wasn't imagining it. Someone was definitely outside the door. Again, I walked over to the door, but this time, I hesitated before opening it. "Who's there?" I whispered. No answer, just more knocking. My hand shook as I unlocked the door and pulled it open. Once again, the hallway was empty, but this time something felt different. The air was colder, and I had the eerie feeling that someone or something had just been there. I shut the door quickly, locking it again. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the fear that something wasn't right. The next morning at breakfast, I overheard two older passengers talking at the table next to us. One of them said something about the ship being haunted. My ears perked up. Haunted? On a cruise ship? Curious, I leaned in to hear more. "You know the story, don't you?" one of the women said. "It was years ago, during a terrible storm. A woman went missing from her cabin, vanished without a trace. They say she fell overboard, but no one knows for sure. Some people think her spirit still roams the ship, trying to find her way back." The other woman shook her head. "I have heard that story too. Some passengers say they hear knocking at their doors late at night. It's her, they say, the lost passenger, looking for someone to help her." A chill ran down my spine. That night, I could barely sleep. I kept telling myself it was just a silly story, something made up to scare people. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. At exactly 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the knocking again. This time, it was faster, more urgent. Tap, tap, tap. I lay frozen in my bed, staring at the door. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know what or who was outside. Tap, tap, tap. The knocking grew louder, echoing through the quiet cabin. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. Slowly, I got up and walked toward the door, every step heavier than the last. I placed my hand on the doorknob, but this time, I didn't open it. Instead, I leaned against the door and whispered, "What do you want?" For a moment, everything was silent. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard a soft, raspy voice whisper back, "Let me in." I stumbled backward, my blood turning cold. The voice wasn't angry or threatening. It sounded lost, like whoever was outside didn't know where they were or how to get home. I didn't open the door. The knocking stopped, and the cabin fell into an eerie silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too scared to move. The next morning, I told my parents everything. They didn't believe me. They said it was just my imagination, or maybe someone playing a prank. But I knew what I had heard. For the rest of the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lost passenger was still out there, wandering the ship, looking for someone to let her in. And every time I walked down the quiet hallways late at night, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see her ghostly figure standing in the shadows. When we finally returned to shore, I was relieved to step off the ship. But even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, listening for that soft tap, tap, tap on my door. And every time, I wonder if she's still out there, searching for someone to let her in.